The ignore normal slope check button is a really important setting when you're brushing fur or hair. What it does is that when it's turned on, it's going to ignore the normal slope of the surface. So in this case you see that it's painting both the backside of the leg and also the leg on the backside here. But if I turn it off, it's only going to brush sort of one side of the leg. So this is really useful when, for instance, painting an ear. If you only want to paint one of the sides, or if you want to paint both sides, you can just turn it on. And it's also very useful to use this when you're trying to mask something, like for instance the inside of a mouth or around the claws on the feet or something. This setting is really useful. So for instance you can do this, enable it to mask everything out, and then turn it off again when you want to show things again. The height brush lets you change the height of the fur, and you can use the magnitude slider to set the length. And the values of the magnitude slider corresponds to the values of the height range slider. So a value of 0 on the magnitude slider would correspond to the minimum value of the height range slider, and a value of 1 would correspond to the maximum value of the height range slider. And in that way you can also change the height after you've done the painting, like this. The width brush works in a similar way as the length brush. You can use the magnitude slider to paint the width, and the values of the magnitude slider corresponds to the values of the width range slider. So a value of 0 would correspond to the minimum value of the width range slider, and a value of 1 would correspond to the maximum range. That way you can also change the height by adjusting the slider after you've done the painting. The rotate root brush is mainly useful when using card-based rendering, and it lets you change the orientation of the entire card. When using this, make sure that the randomized rotation is set to 0, otherwise it's going to be overridden by the randomized rotation slider. The bend brush will bend the strands in the brush direction. The orient brush works in a similar way as the bend brush, with the difference that it tilts the entire card from the root instead of bending it. The twist brush lets you twist the strands. So in order to get correct results using this brush, you'll have to increase the subdivision count a bit. So now we're starting to get correct results. And you can also use the spread slider to choose how much the twisting should spread. And the twist amount changes the intensity. And you can also twist entire clumps if you have a clump modifier, on your layer like this one has. So here we see that the entire clump is twisted instead of the individual hair strands, and you can also combine the two, so you twist the hair strands and also the clumps. The attract brush attracts the strands towards the position where you start brushing. The smooth brush smooths out your groom, so it sort of evens out the hairs. And you can also change these slider values to choose how much of the individual properties should be affected by the smoothing. So for instance, if I set the length and width and orientation to 0, it will only smooth out the bending amount, which is nothing in this case, but it has some values for the orientation, so now it smooths out the orientation. The reset brush will reset your groom to the initial position. So now this will turn everything back to the way it was when the fur was initially added. And you can also change these sliders to affect how much the individual properties should be affected by the reset. The mask brush lets you hide and show strands, and a performance optimization would be to permanently delete the masked strands. So now they won't appear again, even though I used the show strands brush. However, if you change the hair strand spacing, they will be back in the room again, so now I can show them again. The clump mask brush lets you change the intensity of the clumping. So in this case I don't really have a clump yet, so I can hit this button to add a clump modifier. That's going to add a clump modifier down here to my layer. So now we see that we have a clump, and then I can use the clump mask brush to paint in the intensity, because now everything's set to maximum intensity. So now I can paint in how intense the attraction should be. So if I set it back to 1, it's going to be really intense. 0, it's nothing. The raise brush is mainly useful when using card-based rendering in combination with rotate root. So what it does is it sort of just tilts the cards downwards, and if you're using strand-based rendering, it can sort of be used to create some noise as well if you combine it with randomized rotation. The motion and wind slider lets you change how much specific areas of the fur should be affected by motion and wind. So if I set the magnitude slider to 0 and paint in that value on the top here, and then enter play mode, Let's turn off this slider to get the normal colors. Now we see that only the bottom part is affected by the physics. The color override brush lets you paint in colors on your fur. And you have to set the override amount to 1 in order to see some results. And if I set the override amount back to 0 and start painting, it's going to erase the colors again. One important thing when using this is to use a material that supports vertex colors, like all the fluffy hair shaders. So it's important to use one of those materials down here on your fur renderer. The lock selection check button lets you lock selection to paint mode. So when this is turned off and I click on something else here, you see that the ground is now selected. And that can sometimes be annoying when you're painting and you just sort of missed your mesh, and then something else is selected and you have to select your mesh again. So in order to fix that, you can use the lock selection check button. So now when I click something else, it's still going to be in paint mode, so I can still paint the fur. But it's also important to turn this one off if you're going to do something else, because for instance now I can't really select the ground. So if I turn it off again, now I can select the ground. The groom all layers check button is useful for when you want to groom all of your layers at the same time. So my deer here has 2 layers, and right now if I try to brush, it's only going to brush one of the layers. It's a bit hard to see since the strands are so thin, so I'm just gonna go increase them a bit so you can see it. So now it's only brushing sort of the detail layer. But if I enable this check button, it's going to brush both of the layers at the same time. The mirror mode check button enables mirror painting. So if I enable this, you see that I get a second stroke on the right side there, but it's not really correct since it's just flying up in the air. And to fix that, we can hit the restore bind pose button. That's gonna set the character back to in bind pose. Now you see that we can paint both sides of the character at the same time. The hair strand spacing slider lets you change the minimum distance between each strand. So by increasing this, the fur is gonna be less dense. The width range slider lets you change the global width of the cards or strands. The height range slider lets you change the height of the strands. And the randomize rotation slider lets you randomize the rotation of the cards or strands. And the randomize height slider will randomize the height of the cards or strands. The clump modifiers can be useful in order to add some texture to your fur. So I just added a clump modifier, and now you see that it's chunked into these clumps. And if I, for instance, decrease this, the clump spacing, I'm gonna get some smaller clumps. And I can also add multiple layers of clumps. So if I add one more, we now have 2 layers of clumps. So if I change the attraction curve of the first one, you can sort of see that the smaller clumps are attracted into one big clump. And it's also useful to use the clump mask to change how intense the clumping should be in certain areas. The subdivision slider lets you change the tessellation factor of each strand. So right now it's set to 4, so it's got this pretty blocky look. If I set it down to 1, it's just going to be one triangle. And if I set it up to something like 13, it's going to be pretty accurate based on the strand shape curve. You can use the strand shape curve to change the appearance of each card to something like this, for instance. Make it really thin towards the root or thick towards the root, and you can pretty much create whatever shape you like. The motion curve lets you change the stiffness of the strand from root to tip. So if I, for instance, create this type of curve, it's going to be really stiff from the root and get a bit looser towards the tip. But this type of curve is going to make it really loose at the root and all the way up to the tip. So this setting is with a really loose root, and this setting is with a really kind of a stiff root. The export groom to file option exports everything to a fur container, and a fur container is similar to, let's say, a mesh that you can reuse and apply to different fur renderers. And you can also save the groom container in order to be able to continue grooming later on. So now it's been exported to a file, and this fur container can now be applied to the fur renderer that we have here. So you could use this to create different grooms and just change the groom by replacing the fur containers. And you also see here that I have the option to enable grooming, and that's because I also saved the groom container, which is required in order to keep grooming later on. The export to skin mesh option lets you export everything to a mesh or a skin mesh, and that's going to create a new game object with the mesh. So now we see that we have our fur render has been disabled, and we now have a new object here which contains a mesh with the fur attached to it. So it's skinned to our character, but this option doesn't work with blend shapes. So as you see here, the open mouth is actually a blend shape. So you see that the fur has come above the mouth, and also it doesn't fit quite around the eyes anymore. And also if I hit play, I'm not going to get any physics and wind. But it's useful to use this option in case you're going to be deploying to platforms that don't support compute shaders, or if you just want to use the tool to create small bushes or grass patches or whatever.